On this particular Monday morning in late September, the sun was already beating down with the relentless intensity that made Florida's panhandle infamous among military personnel stationed there. The air was thick with humidity as 20 students assembled in the main classroom for the start of the Advanced Improvised Explosive Device Disposal course, the final phase of their training, before being certified as EOD technicians. Technical Sergeant Lauren Davis stood at the back of the classroom, her auburn hair pulled into a tight regulation bun. At 37, she was noticeably older than most of the trainees, who were typically in their mid-20s. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine, but there was something in her demeanor that seemed at odds with the confidence expected of someone at her rank, a hesitancy in her movements, a tightness around her eyes that suggested constant anxiety. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal Training Center at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, was widely considered one of the most challenging training facilities in the U.S. military. Here, in a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and specialized training grounds, the Air Force molded ordinary airmen into the elite technicians tasked with the most dangerous job in modern warfare, disarming and disposing of explosive devices. Which city are you watching from? Share it in the comments. Maybe someone else from your city is here too. And remember, if you believe heroes appear in the most unexpected ways, hit subscribe and give this video a like. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, announced Chief Master Sergeant Richard Blackburn, the lead instructor for the course. A 20-year veteran of EOD operations with deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades, Blackburn was a legend in the EOD community. His weathered face and the slight limp in his left leg, the result of a partial detonation during a disposal operation in Iraq, were badges of honor in a profession where mistakes were rarely survivable. Welcome to the final phase of your EOD training, Blackburn continued, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of someone who had inhaled too much explosive residue over the years. Over the next 8 weeks, we will push you to your absolute limits. You will learn to identify, assess, and neutralize the most complex explosive devices currently being deployed against our forces worldwide. His eyes scanned the room, taking measure of each student. When his gaze fell on Technical Sergeant Davis, he paused momentarily, a flicker of something recognition, confusion, crossing his face before he continued. A murmur rippled through the students. It was unusual for someone who hadn't been a field operator to serve as an instructor for the advanced course. EOD was a tight-knit community that valued hands-on experience above all else. Before we begin, I want to introduce our assistant instructor for this course. Technical Sergeant Lauren Davis comes to us from Peterson Air Force Base, where she served as an EOD training coordinator. She'll be assisting with classroom instruction and practical exercises. Sergeant Davis will be leading this morning's classroom session on advanced trigger mechanisms, Blackburn said, gesturing for her to take the front of the room. Pay close attention. This information could save your life downrange. Davis nodded stiffly in acknowledgement, her expression neutral, but her hands clasped tightly behind her back, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the more observant students. As Davis moved to the podium, her steps were measured, almost reluctant. She arranged her notes carefully, took a deep breath, and began the presentation. Her voice was steady, but lacked the authoritative confidence typical of EOD instructors. She referred frequently to her notes, occasionally stumbling over technical terminology that should have been second nature to someone in her position. When she reached the section on pressure plate variations, a fundamental component that every EOD tech needed to master, her explanation became noticeably vague. She seemed to be reciting memorized information rather than speaking from experience. "Excuse me, Sergeant," interrupted one of the students, a young staff sergeant named Martinez. "Could you clarify the difference in disarming procedures between the Pakistani double-plate design and the newer Iranian models we're seeing in Syria? The manual seems contradictory on this point." Davis froze momentarily, her eyes darting to Chief Blackburn at the back of the room. The primary difference is in the secondary triggering mechanism," she said finally, her answer technically correct but lacking the practical nuance that comes from field experience. The student nodded, satisfied with the clarification, but the damage was done. The rest of the class now regarded Davis with thinly veiled skepticism. How could someone teaching advanced EOD techniques be unfamiliar with such basic field distinctions? Blackburn stepped in smoothly. What Sergeant Davis means is that the Iranian models typically incorporate a collapsible pressure plate with a mercury switch backup, while the Pakistani designs rely on a mechanical secondary trigger. This means your approach vector needs to be completely different, vertical for the Pakistani models, lateral for the Iranian. By the time the morning session ended at 11 a.m., the atmosphere in the classroom had shifted palpably. The students filed out for their lunch break, whispering among themselves about their apparently inexperienced instructor. How did she even qualify to teach this course? Martinez asked his classmate as they headed to the dining facility. She seems like she's never seen a real IED in her life. Maybe she's strictly administrative? His friend suggested. You know how it is. Sometimes they need to fill instructor slots with whoever's available. Back in the classroom, Davis was gathering her materials when Blackburn approached. "Everything okay, Sergeant Davis?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes assessing. Blackburn studied her for a long moment. The practical exercise this afternoon involves a simulated vehicle-borne IED. Are you comfortable leading that? Or would you prefer I take point? Yes, Chief, she replied, not meeting his gaze. Just a bit rusty on some of the newer devices. A flash of what might have been panic crossed Davis's face before she composed herself. I think it would be better if you led that one, Chief. I'll observe and assist. I understand, Chief, Davis said quietly. I'm just adjusting to the teaching environment. It won't be an issue going forward. Blackburn nodded slowly. Very well, but Sergeant, if there's something I should know about your experience level or comfort with this material, now would be the time to tell me. These students are heading into combat zones. They need instructors who can prepare them for what they'll face. Chief Blackburn led the exercise, explaining the assessment procedures and initial approach techniques. Davis stood to the side, occasionally adding a comment but largely deferring to Blackburn's expertise. The students, having sensed her discomfort in the classroom, now largely ignored her. The afternoon session took place at the training center's vehicle compound, where various cars, trucks, and military vehicles were set up for explosive device training. The students, dressed in their heavy EOD suits, gathered around a battered Toyota pickup truck, the type commonly used by insurgents for vehicle-borne IEDs. Blackburn didn't look convinced, but he let the matter drop for the moment. The practical starts at 1 p.m. Don't be late. All right, Martinez, Blackburn called out. You're up first. Show us your initial assessment of the vehicle. Martinez, encumbered by the 80-pound bomb suit, moved carefully toward the truck. He conducted a textbook exterior examination, checking for obvious triggering devices or disturbances in the dust pattern around the vehicle that might indicate recent tampering. I'm seeing what appears to be a pressure plate under the driver's seat, he reported, peering through the window, and possible command wire running to the cargo area. Martinez's response was cut short by a sudden commotion from the edge of the training area. An Air Force Security Forces vehicle had pulled up, and two military police officers were approaching rapidly. I'd establish a safe perimeter, deploy the robot for closer inspection of the undercarriage, and then— Good observation, Blackburn confirmed. How would you proceed? We're in the middle of a training exercise, Sergeant, Blackburn replied, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Chief Blackburn, called the lead officer, a technical sergeant with the name Reynolds on his uniform. We need to speak with Technical Sergeant Davis immediately. All eyes turned to Davis, who had gone very still. I understand, Chief, but this can't wait, Reynolds insisted. It's a security matter. Blackburn sighed and turned to Davis. Sergeant, go sort this out. We'll continue here. Davis nodded and walked stiffly toward the MPs, her back rigid with tension. The students watched curiously as she spoke with the officers, her expression growing increasingly distressed. After a brief but intense conversation, Davis turned back toward the group. Chief Blackburn, she called, her voice tight. I need to report to the commander's office immediately. Security forces will escort me. I'm not sure, she replied, her composure slipping slightly. They wouldn't give me details. Blackburn frowned. Is everything all right, Sergeant? What do you think that's about? One asked. As Davis left with the MPs, the students erupted into speculation. Maybe they finally figured out she doesn't know what she's doing, another suggested with a laugh. Enough, Blackburn said sharply. Back to the exercise. Whatever's happening with Sergeant Davis is none of your concern. None of them could have guessed the truth. But despite Blackburn's admonishment, the incident cast a shadow over the remainder of the afternoon's training. By the time the students were dismissed at 5 p.m., rumors were flying throughout the EOD Training Center. Some suggested Davis had falsified her qualifications. Others speculated that she had failed a security clearance review. The most dramatic theory involved espionage. Perhaps she was being investigated for leaking sensitive EOD techniques to foreign entities. "Good morning," he began, without preamble. "I need to address a situation that developed yesterday regarding your instructor, Technical Sergeant Davis." At 7 a.m. the next morning, the students assembled again in the classroom, but neither Chief Blackburn nor Technical Sergeant Davis was present. Instead, the base commander, Colonel James Wilson, stood at the front of the room, his expression grave. The room fell silent, every student leaning forward slightly in anticipation. Colonel Wilson's expression tightened. "I'm not at liberty to discuss personnel matters in detail. What I can tell you is that there was a misunderstanding regarding Sergeant Davis's assignment to this facility. Effective immediately, Sergeant Davis will no longer be serving as an instructor for this course," the colonel announced. "Chief Blackburn will resume full instructional duties, with a new assistant to be assigned by the end of the week." A hand went up. "Sir, if I may ask, was there an issue with Sergeant Davis's qualifications?" "I never said Sergeant Davis wasn't qualified," the colonel interrupted sharply. "In fact, quite the opposite." Another student spoke up. "Sir, with respect, we're training for one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. If our instructor wasn't qualified—" The students exchanged confused glances. "That's all I can say on the matter," Colonel Wilson concluded. "Chief Blackburn will be here shortly to resume your training. Carry on." As the colonel left, the classroom erupted into renewed speculation. What had he meant by quite the opposite? If Davis was qualified, more than qualified apparently, then why had she seemed so uncertain and hesitant during instruction? The answer came 3 days later, in a way none of them could have anticipated. Colonel Wilson stepped out, accompanied by a woman in Air Force dress blues. Even from a distance, the students recognized Technical Sergeant Davis, though her demeanor was completely transformed. She stood ramrod straight, her bearing now unmistakably military, projecting a quiet confidence that had been entirely absent during her brief tenure as their instructor. The class was conducting a field exercise at the training center's demolition range, practicing controlled detonations of recovered explosive devices. Chief Blackburn was demonstrating the proper placement of shaped charges to safely destroy a simulated artillery shell when a staff car pulled up to the edge of the range. As the two officers approached the group, the students could see that Davis's uniform now displayed several decorations that hadn't been present before, most notably the distinctive purple and gold ribbon of the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star Medal with V device, indicating valor in combat. He turned to Davis and nodded for her to speak. "Attention on deck," Blackburn called, and the students snapped to attention. "At ease," Colonel Wilson said. "I've brought Sergeant Davis back to properly introduce her to you all and to correct a significant administrative error." "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and authoritative, nothing like the hesitant instructor they remembered. "I owe you all an apology for the confusion of the past few days. Due to an error in personnel records, I was assigned to this course under an incorrect profile that didn't reflect my actual experience or qualifications." She paused, looking each student in the eye before continuing. "My name is Technical Sergeant Lauren Davis. I've served with the 66th Training Squadron's EOD flight for the past 11 years, with 4 combat deployments, 2 to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. I've participated in over 100 explosive ordnance disposal operations in theater and served as team leader for the last 3 years of my field service. In 2019, during my last deployment to Afghanistan," Davis continued, "my team was called to disarm a complex IED network targeting a village school. During the operation, one of the devices detonated prematurely. I sustained injuries that required 6 months of rehabilitation and led to my reassignment from field operations to training." She gestured to the Purple Heart on her chest. "This was from that incident. The Bronze Star was awarded for completing the disposal operation despite my injuries, which allowed the safe evacuation of my team and the local civilians." The students stared in stunned silence. This confident, decorated combat veteran bore little resemblance to the uncertain instructor who had fumbled through basic EOD concepts just days earlier. "The personnel error that brought me here listed me as an administrative training coordinator rather than a field-experienced EOD technician," Davis explained. "When I arrived and realized the mistake, I attempted to adapt to the role I was supposedly qualified for rather than the one I actually held. That was my mistake, and it compromised the quality of your training. For that, I apologize." Martinez, who had been the most vocal critic of Davis's apparent incompetence, looked thoroughly chastened. Colonel Wilson stepped forward. The error has been corrected, and Sergeant Davis's full service record has been properly restored in the system. She will be rejoining your training course, not as an assistant instructor, but as the lead instructor for advanced field operations, which is her actual area of expertise. Chief Blackburn will continue to oversee the overall course, the colonel added, but Sergeant Davis will take primary responsibility for the field training components, particularly those involving complex multi-stage devices and booby trap recognition, areas where her combat experience is invaluable. The students exchanged glances, processing this remarkable reversal. The instructor they had dismissed as incompetent was, in reality, one of the most experienced EOD operators on the base. Blackburn stepped forward, extending his hand to Davis. "Welcome back, Lauren, or should I say, Detonator." Davis smiled at the use of her old field call sign. "Thanks, Chief, it's good to be back." Word spread quickly through the group as students shared whatever fragments of information they had heard about Technical Sergeant Lauren Detonator Davis. By the time she turned back to address them, the atmosphere had transformed from skepticism to something approaching awe. As the two instructors began discussing the day's training plan, the students remained in a state of shock. Martinez leaned toward his classmate and whispered, "Did you hear that? She's Detonator Davis. My brother was in EOD in Afghanistan. He told me stories about her. She's a legend in the community. Disarmed a daisy chain of 17 IEDs under direct enemy fire to clear an evacuation route for a wounded Marine unit." As Davis launched into a detailed explanation of the new devices, complete with field anecdotes and practical disarming techniques, the contrast with her previous instruction was stark. This was no textbook recitation, but the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had faced these devices in the field, where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. "All right, people," Davis called out, her voice carrying the natural authority that comes from years of commanding EOD teams in life-or-death situations. "Today we're going to cover advanced trigger mechanisms for real this time. Specifically, we'll be looking at the new generation of passive infrared sensors being used in the Anbar province. These aren't in your manuals yet because they only started appearing 2 months ago." For the next 3 hours, she led them through increasingly complex scenarios, demonstrating techniques that weren't taught in any manual but had been developed by operators in the field. Her hands, which had seemed so uncertain days before, now moved with the precise confidence of someone who had disarmed hundreds of real explosive devices. "The key thing to remember," she told them as they practiced approaching a particularly devious device, "is that every bomb tells a story. The materials, the construction techniques, the placement, they all give you information about the bomb maker. Learn to read those signs and you're not just disarming a device, you're getting inside the mind of your adversary." By the end of the day, the transformation was complete. The students who had dismissed Technical Sergeant Davis as an incompetent administrative officer now hung on her every word, recognizing that they were learning from one of the most experienced EOD operators in the Air Force. As they packed up their equipment, Martinez approached Davis hesitantly. "Sergeant Davis," he began, "I wanted to apologize for my attitude during your first day of instruction. I was disrespectful and I was wrong." "Still, I should have shown more respect," Martinez insisted. Davis regarded him thoughtfully. "You aren't wrong, Martinez. I was giving poor instruction because I was trying to teach from a position I didn't hold. In EOD, we can't afford to pretend we know things we don't. That gets people killed. You were right to question me." More importantly, they left with a deeper understanding of the EOD mindset, the blend of technical knowledge, situational awareness, and calm under pressure that separated the truly exceptional bomb technicians from the merely competent ones. "Respect is earned in our field," Davis replied, "and now I'll earn it properly by teaching you what I actually know, not what some personnel file says I should know." Over the following weeks, Technical Sergeant Lauren Davis proved herself to be one of the most effective instructors the EOD Training Center had ever seen. Her combination of extensive field experience and natural teaching ability transformed the course. Students who trained under her consistently scored in the highest percentiles on their final evaluations. The personnel error that had initially placed Davis in an impossible position became something of a legend at the training center, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that true expertise often came wrapped in unexpected packages. 6 months later, As she watched another class of EOD technicians graduate from the training course, Chief Blackburn approached her with a smile. For Davis herself, the experience was transformative in a different way. After her injury in Afghanistan, she had struggled with the transition from field operator to instructor, feeling that she had lost a core part of her identity. But seeing the impact she could have on the next generation of EOD technicians, potentially saving lives through the knowledge she imparted, gave her a new sense of purpose. Speaking of which, Blackburn continued, I got a call from Colonel Wilson this morning. CENTCOM is requesting experienced EOD instructors for a 6-month deployment to train Allied forces in the new counter-IED protocols. They specifically asked for you. You've done good work here, Detonator, he said, using the call sign that had once again become common knowledge throughout the EOD community. These kids are better prepared than any class I've seen in years. Davis nodded, watching the newly certified technicians celebrating their completion of one of the military's most challenging training programs. They're good. They'll do well downrange.